Hey, welcome back. Another edition of the Melillo Method Podcast, Everything Brain, with myself, Dr. Robert Melillo, and Dr. Peter Scire. And we're here, and, this has been really great. We've been getting a great response so far. I think we've been getting really great feedback on what we're talking about.
Yeah, a lot of people are coming out of the woodworks and saying that these topics are really interested in, and they want to see where we're going next. So.
Yeah, which is what we figured. The reason why we're doing this is because there's so much information that we have, and there's so much misinformation out there. And a lot of people don't know about the brain. I don't know if we mentioned last time, but someone told me recently that the number one Google search term in the world right now is brain health.
Oh, wow. I know it's like one of the largest hashtags that's out there.
Yeah. So it is, one of the things that's resonating with people. When you talk about brain health, again, most of it is, really kind of not really about the brain. It's really about the gut, or it's about other things. But when we talk about brain health and how the brain works and how the brain actually regulates the body, that's what we talk about, I think, at the deepest level. So there's a lot of people out there that are interested in it. So
I'm really excited where I think we're going to go today. I want us to talk about, the excitement over the new book.
Yeah.
The new book's been out, a couple of weeks now, and, it's growing on the Amazon level numbers of where we're at. I think like the day it was released, it was under 10,000 in terms of the amount of books out there. So tell us more about what you've been up to. I know you've been doing some podcasts regarding the books and some videos.
Yeah, it's so cool to think 15 years after the first one came out that a new edition is coming out, and it's more popular than when it first came out or any other point, right? So this is the third edition, and the interest over it is huge right now. We're getting a lot of feedback. Our social media is blowing up, and as you said, on Amazon, it's really right from day one was really very high. Give people context. I think at any given time there's about 1 million books on Amazon. If you're in the top 100,000, you're pretty good. And if you're in the top 10,000, you're doing really well, and you're guaranteed to be at the top of different bestseller lists.
Yeah, I think in one category, I think in the learning disability category, both books, actually, the second edition and the new edition were in the top 20 in the category for learning disabilities.
Yeah. At one point in the bestseller list for autism, I think it was number 3.
Oh, wow.
And so, that's pretty good. And, the fact that there's this much interest in it and, it's growing is great. It just, again, shows that this is resonating and that we keep on refreshing it too. So, there's a lot of new information in this book. Anytime you do a new edition, you have to have at least 25% new material. And I think we have more than that, probably 30-40% more new material in there. And I think we've given people a lot of what they really want of late, because, like where we've been going over the past few years is really looking especially at retained primitive reflexes. And, a lot of people don't know much about that and how important it is. And we've really highlighted that in research and its relationship to motor development and all those things that people don't really understand that are really key features of development of the brain itself, and also really one of the main causes of why we have these developmental imbalances.
What I also liked was the fact that you took right out of the gate the whole change in the milestones from the CDC that happened several years ago, and the blowback that came back on them from many people in the disciplinaries of childhood developmental disorders. So why don't you talk about that, about that importance of making sure parents understand these critical milestones that you still believe are essential indicators of whether or not the brain is actually developing in the sequence it should early on.
Yeah, I refer to it as the brain developmental blueprint, right? That there's a blueprint to how the brain is supposed to be optimally built. And I think that's what we all want for our children, is to have their brain be optimally built, to have them become the best version of themselves, right? We don't want our child's brain to be built in a mediocre way. So it's like I say, there's a blueprint, and it's, most blueprints are pretty. It's not like, when you're building a house or a building here in New York City, they're going to give you a blueprint and say, hey, these are just suggestions on how you should build it. It's really specific. It's like if you deviate a little bit here, this building may collapse on somebody, right? And that is true with brain development. And you would think that the brain is probably one of the most complex things we know of in the universe. Really, it's even as complex as the universe itself. And you would imagine that it's pretty specific instructions that go along with building the brain. And, yet over the years, it's become looser and looser and looser to the point where, like you said, right during COVID, which wasn't coincidental, they came out with these new guidelines, where they expanded it out and actually even said that crawling wasn't a milestone anymore, which is pretty insane. And almost anybody, I didn't meet anybody that went, oh yeah, that makes sense. Anybody, if you told a parent, they were like, what? Any other doctor, they were like, what do you mean it's not a milestone anymore, right? So what we've been doing and what we see is that there's been this normalization of pathology where, the rationale they used to make crawling not a milestone was, well, when we look at children now, more than 50% don't crawl normally. So therefore, crawling is not normal, right? That's the rationale they used, which was just a statistical analysis, which, has no sense whatsoever, but it's, people that just look at data and just look at, well, the statistics say that if we're looking at a normal curve, it's not normal anymore, so therefore crawling isn't normal, so therefore crawling isn't a milestone, right? Mm-hmm. When you use logic like that kind of left brain, but it doesn't make any common sense, which is the right brain. We have too many people where, not having any common sense anymore.
All those number crunchers, right?
Yeah, and it's just, and again, they don't really know anything about brain or brain development. They're just looking at statistics, or the idea that we don't want to make people feel bad, or we don't want mothers to be stressed out, but parents, what they want is they want real information. They don't want you to coddle them. They want you to tell you the truth, like what's going on. Is my child developing properly or not? If not, then tell me. But they don't know what to do about it, and that's kind of the biggest issue.
Yeah, so when we talk about the lack of the development of the crawling, but it's really more so about muscle tone and the development of these vestibular mechanisms that should be coming online early on in that developmental period between, let's say, 0 and 6 months. And those are really initiated by these primitive reflexes that you've been studying for 20 years now.
Yeah, right. It goes back to how is the brain actually built, and why are these milestones important? What is actually happening during that time? It's not about just saying, oh, well, they're there. It's about, if you really understand the way it's being built, you would understand that. And we know that, brains evolved on this planet because a living thing moved under its own power, that if you're a plant or something that doesn't move, you don't need a brain. So we know that brains are also what are initiated by movement in childhood. And movement is the thing that drives brain development. And we know that human brains are basically the most immature brain at birth because we, of all primates, have the largest brain per body size. But because we're bipedal, we also have the smallest birth canal. So there's this conundrum. We have this small birth canal, but we're going to have this really big head. And so it's like, okay, and most moms, I think, would agree they wouldn't want the head to be any bigger before it gets out. So the head in humans has to be restricted. The brain, the biggest organ we have in our body, it needs to be restricted before birth. And it also means that there has to be some mechanism of saying, well, when can I grow? Like when should we really start getting the brain to grow? We have to know when we're outside the womb. And so when we're outside the womb, what's the difference between inside and outside? Inside, you're covered in this fluid and you really don't have a lot of sensory input as much. You hear sound, but it's muffled. You smell and taste things, but it's not the same. You're not really seeing a lot of light. So when you're born, you're bombarded by all these senses. And these senses then bombard the brain and literally turn on the genes that get the brain to build. But to really maximize that, we need to move. But the brain is so immature in humans that they don't have any volitional control over movement. So how do they move? And they need to move to build the brain, but they don't have the area of the brain or the motor cortex really developed to be able to do that. They're born with these things called primitive reflexes. And these primitive reflexes, we've known about for over 100 years. Going back, Joseph Babinski talked about it in 1895. and it's been part of pediatrics and pediatric neurology for decades. And even now, a pediatric neurologist will look at primitive reflexes in children in the first year. The controversy comes in, and I think really the new information that we're creating is around, the concept of retained primitive reflexes, meaning do these reflexes go away? In traditional pediatric neurology, they assume 100% of the time, without fail, these primitive reflexes go away. And what others have been talking about for years, and what we've really been able to show in our research, is that that doesn't happen. And in many cases, and I think in growing cases, we see more and more kids that have retained primitive reflexes. And if you don't get rid of them in the first year, you never get rid of them. And that is a key feature because it interferes with movement.
So the primitive reflexes that we're talking about the reflexes, let's say like the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex and the tonic labyrinth reflex and the symmetrical tonic neck reflex. These are reflexes that are tied to the muscle system and the vestibular system, and also coordinate ocular motor function or eye movements. And then we have other specific reflexes like the snout reflex and the rooting reflex and the palmar reflex that do very specific things. So why don't you elaborate a little bit more about where those reflexes live in the brain, and if they are retained, what's happening in terms of the lack of function?
Yeah, that's a good point, because that was really one of the main questions we asked in our research. One, we proved that these reflexes can be retained beyond one, but then the question was, so what? What does it mean, right? Does that mean anything? And so we really showed that it does. And so when you look at the brain being built, the brain is built from the bottom up. So it's like building a building. This is how I explain it to parents or people. And the bottom of the brain is the medulla, and then the pons, right? Those are two areas. And that's where a lot of stuff is in that area.
Yeah.
And when a baby's just born, that is the area that's on. And in that area are other important nuclei, like that regulate heart rate and digestion, and ultimately also regulate immune system, so the autonomic system. So the medulla is where most of these reflexes really come from, and it makes sense because they're the first type of movements, and so they're in the brainstem. We have these reflexes that will allow for really basic, simple movement, motor activity, that will then engage the senses. And so it takes place in the medulla. And the medulla needs to be solid, right? The foundation of the brain needs to be solid. And to be solid, it means that it has to mature fully. And so as the brain is maturing, the reflexes should become inhibited, and then the brain builds in stages till literally the brain grows, and then it comes down. So that's called bottom-up development, and then that leads to top-down regulation. And that needs to happen on the right brain and the left brain. So going up and going down, that's called vertical integration. Going right and left at the same time, that's called horizontal integration. So these reflexes are in the lower part of the brainstem, and they're really there even before we're born. And they're there to really create these simple movements that first allow for them to literally birth themselves. So like the asymmetric tonic neck reflex that you mentioned, if a baby turns their head to the right or even in the womb, then what happens is it causes an extension of the leg and the arm on that side of head turn, and flexion on the opposite side. So this is perfect for the baby to twist down the birth canal to the right, which is what they're supposed to do to get themselves in position. And so then once they're in there, now they have to push out through the birth canal. So they have the spinal gland, which are these reflexes along the spine. If you stroke it in a baby, they will literally flex to the side. And what that does is helps them push through the birth canal. And then there's something called the tonic labyrinthine reflex, which is a reflex that in an infant, if you bend their head, their whole body collapses, almost like a puppet on a string. And then if you extend the head, it straightens up. So literally as they come through the birth canal, as their head starts to pop out, their head will go into extension, and they literally shoot themselves out of the birth canal. Now, if they don't go through the birth canal because of C-sections, which we see more and more commonly, they're not using those reflexes. And the point is, and the principle is, that you need to use the reflex to get you through a certain stage of development that then creates a certain level of feedback that grows the brain and then grows the next layer. And then we have another type of developmental milestone that we're supposed to meet. and that represents other reflexes. And we go through these stages, and it becomes a little bit more and more complex. And so these reflexes then, once the baby's born, then that same asymmetric tonic neck reflex is going to help them eventually roll over around 3 to 5 months. And then the spinal galant will help them actually crawl on their belly. And the asymmetric tonic neck reflex helps to do that. And then eventually they get up on their hands and knees, and they start to rock. And they do the symmetric tonic neck reflex. And when they do that, that inhibits the tonic labyrinthine reflex, right? Because it does something different. And then, baby should be sitting up around that time, and then they should crawl for a couple of months at least. And then they start pulling themselves up, which is called a hands pulling reflex. And then they walk along the furniture. And then right around 12 years, 12 months exactly, they should walk, and they should be saying 3 to 5 words. And they should have really good eye contact, and they should be pointing. They should be having joint attention. All of that should happen at that point. And then at that point, all the reflexes should now be integrated or inhibited and gone. And now that allows for more complex movement, which allows us to build a more complex brain. And that's the way it's supposed to go. And if it doesn't happen, if the reflexes don't go away, which we showed happens like in cases, let's say with autism, 100% of the time they never go away. And if they don't go away, what we've been able to show is that it keeps the brain in a more immature state, and it keeps the movement in a more immature state. And since movement is what drives, there's a saying in science, simple movement, simple brain, complex movement, complex brain. If we keep the movement simple because we haven't got through the reflexes, then we're going to keep the brain simple and less complex. And a less complex brain equals all the types of neurobehavioral disorders and mental health things we see throughout the lifetime.
And one of the reflexes that's intimate to the ones you named off is the Moreau reflex, and the reflex that it can be initiated through the movement of the body and by activating the vestibular canals, or also by an auditory aspect. And that if that reflex is retained, we're looking at a more of a child that may have a lot more sympathetic fight or flight response, and when we get that sympathetic response, or we're dampening parasympathetic function, that especially in regards to vagal output and the relationship to parasympathetics to the GI system. So, that's why we see a lot of these kids have such immature gastrointestinal function.
Yeah, and that's, when we look at what the problem is, we say the problem is there's, in almost every case, there's no injury, there's no genetic mutation, there's no pathology, there's no metabolic disorder. It is this brain staying in an immature state. So the brain is maturationally delayed, but then this leads to a maturational imbalance. And especially in the lower part of the brainstem, which is the foundation. And I explain it to people that if the reflexes are there, that means that foundation was never solid. It was never fully built. So therefore, anything on top of it is not really solid or stable. And so we have to go back and we have to get rid of these reflexes. And if they're there, then this whole area is immature, and everything in there is immature. And as you said, part of development is baby, when they're born, their sympathetic or fight or flight system is online, right at that point. And their parasympathetic, which is called their rest and digest system, is not and won't be online really till more towards the end of the first year. And so what happens is that as that matures, that nuclei, that parasympathetic nuclei is maturing. So as the reflexes go away, the parasympathetic or vagal system actually comes online, and now it starts to inhibit the fight or flight. That changes our whole digestive system and prepares us for solid food and all of that. And it also, calms us down and allows the baby to sleep through the night and eat solid food and have normal poops and everything like that. But also, we know, as you talk about all the time, it also has influence on the developing immune system. And, these are key things. So if the reflexes don't go away, what it signifies is that the brainstem isn't mature, and that means that these kids are going to be in a sympathetic state. And so they're always going to be, their heart rate's going to be fast. They're going to be hard sleeping. They may be constipated. They're not digesting food. They have a leaky gut. And, they may not sleep at night. And also they may have chronic inflammation.
And over the years, what we've noticed when we're testing these reflexes, and what you've seen even in the research studies in your lab, is the asymmetricalness to these reflexes. For example, the Babinski, that you may see an upgoing toe more on maybe the left side versus the right side, or let's say the same thing with a palmar reflex, and then we may see a difference in that. And that's a key difference from how you go about your perspective of looking at this brain asymmetry as opposed to other people that may be traditionally testing these primitive reflexes.
Yeah, and that's, one of the things, I think the biggest thing about the new book is that we really went in detail in chapter 13, I believe, that really teaches people, not just for children, but also for adults, to how do you check for primitive reflexes. If you were going to assess your child, or if you're going to assess your spouse, how do you do that? I also have an online ADHD adult program that we have videos where we teach people how to do that. And that's the whole thing. So anybody out there wants to know, we're talking about you can test for these reflexes. We have tools in the book and online that they can go to, that they can actually learn how to do it on themselves. And it's shocking in many cases because, like when I teach a course, I'll have adults in the audience, and most of them doctors or therapists or PhDs. And what we'll do is we often start with, does anybody really jump when they hear a loud noise?
Yeah.
So if you're out there and you know that if you hear a loud noise, you jump all the time, and you startle really easily, that's the Moreau reflex that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, over the 20 years that I've been, sitting in classes with you, anytime you pulled up, 10 adults out of the audience, I would say maybe 80, if not 90% of those adults had at least 2 to 3, if not 4, retained primitive reflexes, and in some instances, probably maybe 30, 40% of them had almost all of them retained. And again, these are professionals. These are people that have gone on to their basic 4-year undergrad work. Now in graduate school, you've had doctors that have been postdoc doctors, multiple PhDs, and you've had in some of your European lectures, and you're finding these dramatic primitive reflexes. And then when you do their history on them, you hear about their developmental challenges that they had.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that, first of all, primitive reflexes being retained is going to lead to an imbalance between the hemispheres. Those two things are just intimately connected to one another. And the imbalances between the hemispheres is what produces all the symptoms, depending on which way it goes and what areas and what networks are, overactive and what are underactive. So, if anybody's out there, that has any sort of mental health issue, the first thing you should have checked is, do you have these retained primitive reflexes? And if a lot of this goes back to childhood, then there's a good chance that you do. And also, if you've had things like chronic digestive issues or other sort of immune issues or eczema, or other types of problems, then it probably goes back to childhood. But as we always say, the people that are most gifted in an area of the brain, that are most talented, that have stronger areas, are the more likely to develop a vulnerability on the other side, and therefore an imbalance. So therefore, we get people that are incredibly bright. I mean, I get so many PhDs and people that I speak to, and when we demonstrate primitive reflexes, there's many of them, maybe 40% of the audience at least, has retained primitive reflexes. And as you said, there's usually at least 2 or 3 that have all of them there, that haven't gone away at all. And now they're brilliant people, but they've also struggled with certain things their whole life. But in their case, their strength outweighed their weakness. But in other cases, if it tips a little bit more the other way, then the weakness outweighs the strength. And that's what we see in most childhood neurobehavioral issues.
Let's concentrate on another specific reflex, the Babinski reflex. We commonly see it. When we stroke the bottom of the foot, and all of a sudden we get an upgoing toe, and maybe potentially the fanning of the toes. What's its role? Because we get asked all this time in terms of children in a toe walking. Okay, and you have I think a great explanation for how that relates back to the Babinski.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we know, as we said, a lot of kids, probably at least 85% of the kids we work with, maybe more, they don't walk on time. they're walking late. And to me, late is anything beyond 13 months, right? If they're not walking by the end of 13 months, they're late. If they're walking before 11 months, they're too early. Either one of those things is not good. And so, what we see is the Babinski is the last primitive reflex to go away, and it should go away equally on both sides at the same time. And that what you're saying is that Babinski reflex in a baby, if you stroke the bottom of their foot, their toe is going to go back and flare. But to walk, we have to push down. So we have to toe off, we have to push down. So that has to go away for us to be able to walk properly. And so one of the reasons why they might be delayed or have trouble walking or be unsteady early is because they're not going down. And so every time they're rolling their foot is flaring up. And so that they're not stable. And then, what we see is a lot of kids actually are toe walkers. And so, where does that come from? And a lot of people, they'll go to an orthopedist or they'll go to somebody who says, well, this is an orthopedic problem, and they have too much muscle tone of their foot. And that's not true. The problem really is more about their spatial awareness. It's really about where they perceive space. One of the importance of movement, and as you said before, there's these three systems. There's the spinal, postural, core. That's really like a rod that is like the foundation of movement. And the spinal muscles are the engine that all movement really stems from. And that needs to be balanced, and it needs to be strengthened. It needs to be balanced right and left and front and back. And then that leads into the development of the vestibular system, which is about, balancing the head and then the eyes in the head, and then the oculomotor system. And those three systems really form a foundation of the two sides of the cerebellum and two sides of the brain. And that movement, that balance of that movement is really critical. And if that's not happening, if a child isn't moving or if there's asymmetry, then that is a sign that there's something happening with the balance of development and the balance of the brain. And that's where we need to intervene first to change that.
And especially when we're talking about a child having a retained asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, a symmetrical tonic neck reflex, and a tonic labyrinth reflex, because these reflexes are hardwired into those vestibular nuclei that are in the brainstem, giving feedback from the canals, the different vestibular canals, and we have those three pairings of canals, the horizontal canals that allows us to move our head in a rotational way in a no-no position, and then we have our posterior and anterior canals that are going to allow us to move our head in a yes-yes position. So they're constantly feeding back orientation. But then there's also another important part of our inner ear dynamics, our otolytic system, that is going to allow us to actually have linear translational capabilities. So, when we're looking at those children that have maybe these toe walking mechanisms, not only is the Babinski in play, but also we're also talking about, again, the retention of those vestibular-based reflexes and maybe even the otolytic immaturity.
Right. So again, the main nuclei for the vestibular system is in that lower brainstem. And so again, if the reflexes don't go away and if that area hasn't matured, then the vestibular nuclei don't mature. And another area that's really important to that is called the cerebellum. And so what we see is that if they don't mature, then that isn't really registering input. And what we see is we can have some kids that literally will spin them in a chair 100 times and they don't get dizzy. And parents will say that to us. My kid will spin all the time and they don't seem to get dizzy. I mean, we can spin them. They walk up in a chair and walk away. How could that be? What is happening? I mean, their inner ear is fine. But when it comes to getting the signals into the brainstem and registered, it's not registering. And then the final processing of that information is in that right parietal lobe, insular cortex area. And so what we see is all of this has a lot to do with what we call proprioception. And so one of the purposes of the feedback from the muscles, especially our spinal muscles, and then the vestibular system, is that it literally creates a map of our body in our brain. As we move through the world, we're creating a map and saying, okay, this is what our body, where all of our body parts are. And we have a whole map on the right side of the brain, and we have half a map on the left side of the brain. And so we need to develop this map that tells us, where we are, and then also where we are in space. So we know where we are in the room. We have some kids on the autism spectrum that are non-speaking that will type to us that as we're working with them, they start saying things like, I feel my body. I start to feel where my body is. Or they'll say, well, I didn't know where my body was in space. I didn't know where my body was in relationship to other parts of the room. And so what happens is their space around them becomes compressed in a certain way. And usually the shift is to the right and forward, which is what makes someone feel like they're actually falling forward. And so they get up. If you were to stand there, if you're listening, and if you actually stand up and actually literally start to fall forward, what you're going to do to prevent yourself from falling on your face is you're going to go up on your toes, and you're going to walk on your toes. And we know that they have head tilts and they have body tilts, and this is all really because their perception of space is skewed. And proprioception is the master sense. All other senses are really dependent. Vision, hearing are all dependent on proprioception. And if that's skewed, then everything else can be skewed.
And when we have retained primitive reflexes, especially these 18R and the STNR and the tonic labyrinth reflex, if they don't properly integrate, they're not going to allow for these riding reflexes to develop. And that's another thing you're really referring to there, is that if you perceive yourself going forward, are you going to now create, hey, I'm automatically going to put my hands down? Or if I go, we take children and we move them side to side and we see whether or not they have these lateral propping reflexes. So what should happen is, as these primitive reflexes are integrating through their development, we should give rise to these more postural-based reflexes that are going to allow us to really move more into that extensor posturing aspect. And when we fire our extensors, we're going to inhibit more of these flexor muscles, and we're going to fire that cerebellum. We're going to start moving our body in these ways that we're going to fire our vestibular system. We're going to fire our vestibular spinal pathways that are controlling our muscle activity. And that, again, is going to give that constant feedback to the thalamus that allows us to create these very complex brain waves that we have.
Yeah, and that's why our brain is so big, and it's tied into bipedalism, right? Because standing upright and walking upright is really hard to do. No other animal really does it anywhere near like we do. And all of that is achieved because of that delicate balance and our body ability to perceive where it is in space, and the balance of muscle tone that allows us to do that, and where our inner ear is constantly giving signals, and that's moving our eyes, and our eyes are giving us 3D vision because we have two eyes that give us what's called stereopsis, so we can see where we are in space. But even if you close your eyes, you shouldn't fall down. If people want to know, do you have good proprioception, stand with your feet together, close your eyes. If you fall, you don't have good proprioception. And, it's usually the problem is an imbalance. It's not that it's gone completely. It's that there's an imbalance in that system, and that can then lead to things like vertigo. If anybody's ever suffered from vertigo, it can be terrible, right? And we know that that's an imbalance in the inner ear or the firing within the brain or the brainstem. But even just from a sense standpoint and muscle tone standpoint and regulating where we are in space. And, if you look at yourself in the mirror and you have a head tilt and you have some like facial asymmetry, you probably have an imbalance in that core, musculosensory system.
So the first part of your assessment is looking at these primitive reflexes, and then the second major step in the assessment process is really looking for these muscle imbalances, and looking at muscle imbalances between these extensor muscles that we have and our flexor muscles, and then the comparison from side to side or upper body versus lower body, and then assessing, like you said, the head tilt positions that we may find children in. They might be tilting to the right, or they may not only tilt to the right and have a head rotation in the opposite direction. What does that mean?
Yeah, what it means is that, the way that we're dictating tone in the eye, even when there's a lazy eye. I mean, for the most part, a lazy eye, unless there's damage to the eye or the muscle, has nothing to do with the eye or the eye muscle. It really has to do with the muscle tone, which is really more regulated by the brain and imbalances in the brain. And so the idea of having balance, having symmetry, and being able to coordinate both sides, that's the key thing to being able to stand up and walk. The key thing to walking is synchronization. And that means we have to have good perception of where our body is. We have to have good equal tone. We have to have balance front and forward and right and left. We need to know where we are in space. We need to be able to time that and coordinate it properly. We need to be able to know and be able to see, like I said, in 3D, so we know spatially where we are, but we need to also have a sense, even if we're not seeing, if we're walking in the dark, where we are. And so all of that is critical. And actually, if we don't feel that, even on a subconscious basis, this can create a lot of things like anxiety. I just sent you that paper that is looking at hypermobility of joints. You know, there's something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is really a syndrome of hypermobile joints. Well, why are the joints hypermobile? And it's usually because there's not the appropriate sense of proprioception that is sent by the joints and the muscles. The muscles are primarily where we get the sense. And if we have low tone, we have poor proprioception. If you have high tone, you have good proprioception. You have to have balanced tone to really be able to understand where your body is. And so in this paper, they talk about how if you have hypermobility of your joints, it's because you don't have good proprioception. And if you don't have good proprioception, your brain doesn't know where your body is, and it therefore can't make predictions. So you're constantly getting error feedback to your brain saying, error, error, error. You're doing, something's wrong. And this triggers the autonomic system and the sympathetic system and the fight or flight system. And it triggers a sense of anxiety and fear because our brain is constantly being triggered, you know, these error signals that you don't know where you are. And you think you're here, but you end up here. And your eyes are telling you one thing, and your body and your brain is telling you another thing. And that can be a core feature that is also related to something called interoception that we talk about a lot.
And unfortunately, for many of those cases, you know, most people are just going to go, oh, you have anxiety, you have depression, but they're not looking at the relationship of someone's muscle tone or making that connection that does some person have altered vestibular output, or do they even have retained primitive reflexes? So I think that's the most frustrating thing for our families that are going and getting these multiple diagnoses because no one is really connecting like you said, this developmental blueprint and how the brain is built and looking at all these systems and how they're supposed to be working in coordination with each other. One key point I wanted to bring up was that you talked about the bilateral coordination that's a necessity of the brain, but one of the things that also prevents that from happening is the retained reflex of the asymmetrical reflex that really allows you to create that homolateral movement early on in development.
Right. Yeah. Early on, one of the things I ask parents is, you know, I go through these stages. I say, you know, did your child first of all, were they actually born in a normal way? Did they have a C-section? Then, you know, did they roll over on to both sides at 3 to 5 months? I mean, also the earliest thing for me that tells me a lot about tone is, can the baby latch on and actually breastfeed? Probably 85, 90% of the kids that we work with, from the beginning, they couldn't latch on. They had low tone, which is really representing that their brain is more immature when they're born. And that altered tone is what starts to alter movement. And then that's also partly why they don't get rid of these reflexes. And then not getting rid of the reflexes changes their muscle tone. And that affects them hitting those milestones. So, you know, we want to know 3 to 5 months, did they roll over to both sides? And then did they go on their belly and do a commando crawl? And then did they go on all fours? And we go through that. People will come in and say, oh, my kid hit all the milestones. And I'll say, wait, let me go through it with you. And then when we go back, they almost never do. And even if they did hit it on time, it's also the way they do it matters. Like, did they do it? Like we see a lot. Kids are crawling, but they're dragging one leg, or they're scooting on their butt, or they're hopping like a rabbit. And none of those is the way it's supposed to happen. So it's not just, oh, they crawled in some way on time. It's, did they crawl in the right way for the right period of time? And that's building that blueprint. That's building that stage. And if that stage didn't happen, then that part of the brain wasn't built. And so therefore the next part of the brain is not going to be built properly because it's built on top of it. And so that's where all of that is really important, because it tells us about, you know, what's happening. And that's the other thing that we talked about. One of the second questions we wanted to answer in our paper was, 1, can reflexes be retained? 2, so what if they are retained? And we showed that it leads to immaturity. But then what nobody had looked at before I mean, it's in the literature, people recognize, but no one ever even attempted to try to explain it, was what happens when we have asymmetric retained reflexes, meaning that, if a baby drags one leg and one arm isn't moving, what does that mean? It means they have this retained asymmetric reflex, meaning it's different on one side versus the other. Because when the reflexes go away, they should go away on both sides at exactly the same time. And so what does it mean when you see more of a reflex on one side or the other? And what we showed was it means is that there's a maturational imbalance. So there's not just a general delay in development of the brain. There now is an imbalance where one side of the brain is actually maturing faster than the other. And this asymmetry is what leads to this imbalance, and the imbalance is where all the symptoms come from. And that's the main issue. And so you have to get rid of the reflexes to correct the imbalance, but you're not going to be able to get rid of the reflex if you don't also correct the imbalance. So those two things are intimately tied together. And to me, if a child is being treated, or even an adult with any issues, and you're not looking at those two things, you're not getting to the core root problem, and you're never going to really, make this child meet their full potential. You're never really going to get rid of all these symptoms. You may manage it a bit, you may reduce it a bit, but you're really not getting to the core root problem.
So let's talk about how we even go about rehabbing some of these primitive reflexes. So we've talked about the Babinski, and we stroked the bottom of the foot, and we get a flaring of the toe and the flaring of the big toe and the toes themselves. So one exercise we can simply do is actually just do that same response, so that we constantly just stimulate the bottom of the foot to see that if we do it over and over and over, do we get a little bit of a decreased movement or a crawling of the foot. And the more we do it, the more we're building those pathways from the lower part of the brain, stimulating the upper part of the brain, because ultimately, as it's the upper part of the brain at the frontal lobe, it comes down through the corticospinal pathways that are going to come into the spine and the brainstem and ultimately inhibit these reflexes.
Right. Yeah, so that's the biggest difference, I think, in my previous book and previous approach. Before, the only approach that people would talk about to remediate these reflexes or to integrate them was to do exercises. And these exercises were supposed to primarily reproduce the movement. So if the Moreau makes you go like this, you do a starfish exercise, which is where you're doing that. And so there were these exercises that were really out there, and they were like the only ones that anybody did. So that is what was being done. However, when I started really developing the Melillo Method and really working with children and kids that were really severely impaired, like non-speaking, and I really wanted to figure that out, these kids can't move their body.
Yeah.
They don't know where their body is. They don't have control over their body, and they have dyspraxia or apraxias, and they can't move on command, and they can't move volitionally, and the harder they try to do it intentionally, the more it shuts down. So how do you get rid of these reflexes if they can't do these exercises? Mm-hmm. And people would put them to the passive movements, but it didn't work. I tried it. It didn't work.
I remember years trying that.
So I said, all right, well, the point is we need to activate these reflexes over and over and over and over. And then when we do that, we create that feedback, and then it eventually inhibits them. So how can we do that? And I said, well, when I'm testing for the reflexes, we're activating the reflexes. And that's actually the most effective and specific way. So, what I came up with was that's what we're going to do. At the first level, we're actually going to stimulate the reflexes. And that does two things. One is it makes sure we're activating it because you can see the reflex. Every time you do it, bam, bam, bam. When you're doing the exercises, you don't know if you've actually activated that reflex. And then the other thing is, doing the exercises may take an hour and it's a fight. Yeah. This takes 5 minutes, and you can do it to anybody and any child, no matter what, at any stage. And so you can do it at a really high frequency. It's manageable, and the high frequency is what's needed to get rid of them. If you're not doing it a lot, you're not getting. It's like anything else. You need reps, and so that difference is the biggest difference I think in my work moving forward. Is that activating the reflexes and doing that in somewhat of an asymmetric way, And those two things, I think, have gotten results that, better than anything we've ever gotten before, and in all different types of cases and conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the old ways we used to do it. Like you said, and have these passive exercises, for example, like the lizard exercise that we do for the asymmetrical tonic reflex, and you're trying to get these children to lay on the ground, and you're trying to get them to create these movements of their arm and their leg, and to coordinate them, and they're not there developmentally to do that, and you're spending 2 or 3 people trying to make that happen. Where now we just simply put them in the same position that we would normally test them on all fours, and just start taking the head and rotating the head as many times as the child will allow us to do it.
Yeah. And even if they can't get on all fours
Yeah.
and they're infants, we
Yeah.
can turn the head and it's going to stimulate the reflex.
Yeah.
So, working with that has really been really critical. And so, like I said, I think what people really like about this book, and why I think even a lot of people had previous book is getting the new edition, is because I've never gone into it as detailed. And as you know, and we have all research to back this up, that this has been our focus of research over the past 5-6 years. And we've published, as you said, more than just about anybody right now in the area of these retained primitive reflexes and what's happening. And we're the first ones, I think, that have ever done a age-match controlled, randomized, double-blind study published in some of the top journals in the world, like the British Medical Journal. So, that's where all of that information and all of that research is in there now, and people can now access that. And I never put that in the book before, but, that was where we saw so much information and so much requesting, and that's really what's changed in our practice more than anything else.
And one of the other key things that you saw when you did your research in Cuba with Dr. Machado and his team was not only did you see the retention of the reflex and the severity of the reflex, meaning that, okay, it's one thing to have a reflex, but is it on a scale of 0 being not present, 4 being the maximum present, 100% present, that you saw that if they had 4 plus 4 on their reflexes, that the maturity of the brain was very low.
Right.
And then when you actually went and did the QEEGs, you started just seeing so much of the slow brain rhythms, especially in these older children that should not have slow brain rhythms when they're awake and trying to do some type of cognitive task. You want to talk more about that?
Yeah, and so that's where, I think what we've added to the scientific community is that no one's ever looked at it like this before. We know things like slow brain waves are associated with things like autism, but also schizophrenia and dementia and Parkinson's. So slow brain waves in adults are not good. But nobody ever looked at, well, why are they there? Why do they have slower brain waves? Or why do they have areas that are really slow with areas that are too high? Too fast brain waves that can create anxiety or attention issues or insomnia. And so what we were able to do was, look at the individual patients, children, adolescents, and adults, and we were able to check them neurologically and look for their reflexes and see, like you said, a severity level. So going from 0 to a 4. And then we were able to correlate that with QEEG and looking at their brain waves. And then we also correlated that with a battery of neuropsychological tests, looking at things like IQ and academic achievement and behavioral scales. So we had a whole battery of different functional measurements. And what we were able to show is that when the reflexes didn't go away, the brain was in a more immature state. When it was asymmetric, we saw that it was in an unbalanced state. When we looked at their brain waves, we saw that the brain waves were slower, and that's because in a baby, they start out with very slow brain waves. And as a brain matures, the brain waves get faster, and they become more coordinated and more balanced. So what we were seeing was there was a propensity of slower brain waves in autism, but especially on the right side of the brain, and that relatively faster on the left. And so, again, there was a slower immaturity of the brain waves, and there wasn't this synchronization that should be happening, and that correlated. The more severe the reflexes were inhibited, the more severe that was. And then that correlated with their performance on different cognitive or academic or behavioral scales, so that they had worse performance because their brain was in a more immature state. And then we showed on the reverse that when we simply, taught the parents how to stimulate their child's reflexes over and over with a simple thing like a paintbrush, right? and then gave them something that would stimulate only the right side of the brain. So we gave them a little TENS unit, a little electrical stim unit that they could put on their back and just have it stimulate the right brain. Those two things together, we showed that in 12 weeks, we could get significant changes in not only reduction in the primitive reflexes, so going from like a 4 to a 2 or 4 to 0, but we could also speed up the brain waves. And we had an increase in alpha and gamma rhythm, and gamma is correlated with cognitive ability and coherence in the brain. So when areas of the brain are really talking, they're talking with a gamma rhythm. And so that's the fastest brain wave. And then that correlated with an improvement in their behavior and their behavioral scales and their cognitive skills. And all of that in a significant level. And it just makes sense when you think about it. You kind of look back and go, of course. But you know, if you talk to people in the QEEG world, you know, or neurofeedback, they'll talk about slower brainwaves and faster brainwaves. But if you say to them, well, why are the brainwaves slow? They'll say, well, we don't know, but it's definitely correlated with symptoms. But if you think and you say, well, because the brain is immature. Immature brains are slower. And so therefore that, and how does that relate to the primitive reflexes being there? And how does that relate to immature skills on their academics? And how does that relate to, you know, also the way their body is being regulated, and the sympathetic nervous system is still online and their parasympathetic isn't. So it all really makes perfect sense. And we put that together, and no one's really put that together before like that. And I think it's really, you know, really monumental, because we're really talking about the core issue. But more importantly, we're also talking about a simple thing that we can teach parents to do, which is stimulate the reflexes, you know, 2 to 3 times a day with a paintbrush. Doesn't cost a lot of money. And then find some way, whether it's through tactile or vibration or whatever, stimulate that one side of the brain, and do that consistently. And you're going to completely change that individual's brain and trajectory in the course of their life.
And I think that's the legacy of the book. I think ultimately, from the first book to this book, it's about giving a parent, what, $14, $15 to go buy the book. Yes, it takes some time for them to read the book and you know, digest the information. But if they can dig themselves into the assessment process, and if they were just to go through the primitive reflex assessment and understand that, okay, I got to look for these 10 primitive reflexes, and then I'm going to assess them, and I'm going to scale them. And now he's given me these simple exercises that I can do. How profound they can just do it in the confine of their home and not cost them a bunch of money to do that, and have just this dramatic impact on their child. And obviously, if they want to go and seek us out or seek out other Melillo Method certified practitioners, they're going to get an extensiveness of the program. But the reality of it is that they could really make a big change in their child, just with, like you said, the paintbrush.
Yeah, you know, and this is one of the motivations. As you know, all my research partners are medical neurologists, and some of the best in the world. And, you know, they became more educated to my work, and they've become really, you know, really passionate about it. And they tell me, you know, we didn't know any of this. We didn't learn any of this neurology that you're teaching in the neuroscience and how it relates functionally. And one of our goals was really to be able to make this now a standard in pediatric neurology, and maybe with pediatricians, meaning just look for the reflexes. And then simply, you can have someone in your staff trained that can do it. The doctor doesn't have to do it. And then simply give the parents an instruction on how to stimulate those reflexes. If you just did that alone, and that's, like I said, a lot of the reason why pediatricians or pediatric neurologists just say, well, the milestones don't matter, or it's okay, because they don't know what to do about it. So their thoughts are, well, why stress the parent out when the kid may grow out of it anyway, which they never really do. And they say, so let's just, work there so we won't bring it up. It's because they don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, imagine if we had all these pediatricians worldwide on these wellness visits, being able to, maybe not themselves or just a staff member, like you said, come in, a nurse practitioner or someone like that. They can go in and quickly, in a 5 or 10 minute routine, check these primitive reflexes. Oh, okay, this primitive reflex is living longer than it should in terms of being inhibited. So, okay, now we need to stimulate that reflex right now. Just show the parent
Right.
how to do it.
Yeah.
And talk about it. Early intervention. We talk about it all the time, and how important it is, but this is the most important, early intervention.
Yeah, and it's non-invasive.
Yep.
And it's inexpensive, cost-effective. You can have the parents do it. There's no risks whatsoever. I mean, it would change the course of mental health in this and education more than any single thing. There's not one thing that you could do for brain health that would be more important than getting rid of these reflexes if they're there, and then also understanding the imbalance and the asymmetry. Those are the two foundational things, and anybody can be really taught to do that, and that's the point of the book.
Yeah. And for me, my interest has been over the last 2 years working with a lot of rare disease, a lot of genetic disorders, and I'm always just taken back when I talk to my parents, and I've had some of my parents be occupational therapists or physical therapists themselves, and I'll ask them, did your pediatrician ever check these primitive reflexes? And they go, no. I did the occupational therapist that you took your child to, did they check them? Maybe, I'm not sure. Do you have a report? I get the report back. They never checked it. So here you are in this whole other grouping beyond the autism spectrum group of these rare diseases that really need this assessment to be done immediately, because just by doing that, we've made profound changes in so many of these kids that, like you had cases too, where they were said that they would never be able to sit up, that they might never be able to walk, but yet we can get them to sit up, we can get them to develop these greater muscle tone and extensor posturing that it may allow them to walk one day, or be able to use an assisted walking device to be able to walk.
Mm-hmm. And the other factor about that is also what we call returned reflexes, which means that we know with dementia later on in life, that's why we know that the reflexes never completely go away. Yeah. They become what we call integrated into the nervous system and into movement. But we also know that, if there is a brain injury or brain degeneration, they'll come back. And many people, the only time they look for a Babinski or something like that is when they suspect a brain injury. So,
we refer to these as frontal release signs.
Right. Yeah. And I believe, what's happening is that when you alter trajectory on the front end and slow it down, what happens is you get a faster decline at the end. Yeah. And so I think what we're seeing is that these reflexes will have an impact on your whole life and on your whole body. And ultimately, they can be changed in a really simple way, and at any time. It's never too late. And we've even seen it with even doctors in my course or whatever. When we temporarily get rid of the reflex, they feel completely different. Their anxiety goes away, or it's incredible.
One other point that you mentioned regarding the research that you were doing. So during that research that you did with the subjects you got published in the British Medical Journal, and you talked about how you were also looking at autonomic aspects. And so isn't that what's going to be happening now with some of your new papers coming out, that you're going to be publishing papers on heart rate variability and what you saw with that autonomic testing? Yeah.
So as we were doing the EEG, you also have an EKG lead. And EKG means an electrocardiogram while we're doing an electroencephalogram. And it's really one of the most accurate ways to look at heart rate variability. And so that means we're looking at what's happening with the heart and the autonomic and the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. And, real simply put, when you have high heart rate variability, that's good. And that means your parasympathetic nervous system is working. You have low heart rate variability, that's not good. That means that your heart just stays steady and fast generally. That's what you see in coma. And that's not good. And that means your sympathetic nervous system is really high. And so we were able to show that as we changed the brain waves and as we changed all these other factors, we also were able to slow the heart rate and increase heart rate variability, which means we were changing that brainstem area, we were changing the balance of those nuclei. And that impact, something that we both want to do a lot of research on, because that is where the impact on the immune system and neuroinflammation and all of the, gut biochemical things or biomedical issues or hormonal issues or all of the issues, really, that's the foundation of that. And so that's where, I'm really excited about our research moving forward. We're working on a paper together right now. It's going to integrate all this together. But yes, that heart rate variability paper is going to be submitted very shortly, and that should be coming out, and that really is, again, bringing it all together.
So, in closing, for us, I think the biggest thing that we want to take away is got to pick up the book and start reading the chapter on the primitive reflex, and then be able to take your child through a primitive reflex evaluation. And if you determine that your child has these retained primitive reflexes, immediately turn to chapter 13 and start working on these individual remediation exercises of primitive reflexes.
Yeah, I think, those two chapters, even if you read the book before, they're completely different. But then the other thing that resonates with people is when they go through and they read that right and left brain symptoms and the checklist, and they check it off and they go, oh my God, this makes so much sense. Now I understand where these symptoms all come from. So those two things are good. But yeah, so get the book. And, again, it's not just for children, because we get adults read it and they go, oh, that was me as a child. And I understand it now, because, as we said, all adult mental health issues now, we know, start in childhood. And they really are related to everything that's in this book. So,
well, it was great catching up with you as always, and look forward to doing more of these episodes.
All right, great. All right. Bye, people.